the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon hung heavy in the air when I heard it. The soft, cutting laughter that froze me mid-step. My daughter-in-law's voice, sharp and cruel, mocking the scars my husband had carried for most of his life. The glow of the Christmas lights blurred as my heartbeat thundered in my ears. In that moment, warmth turned to ice. If you've ever discovered something you wish you hadn't, something that changed how you saw the people you love, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this, they happen in the quiet corners of families more often than you think. I wanted to turn away, to unhear it, but the truth had already taken hold. That was the moment everything started to unravel. It happened just before dinner. The house smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon candles, and I remember thinking how warm everything felt until I heard her voice. My daughter-in-law's laughter cut through the noise of plates and music. I stood by the hallway, frozen, as she told someone that my son's father looked pathetic with those scars on his face, that he made everyone uncomfortable. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My husband, Edward, had earned those scars serving his country, and though years had passed, I knew how much pain he carried in silence. Hearing her words felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to step forward, to say something, but my body wouldn't move. I felt the same ache I did decades ago when I first saw the scars myself. Only this time, it wasn't pain for what he endured. It was pain for what someone he loved had just done to him. When Edward walked in moments later, smiling and holding a bottle of wine, I realized what she had stolen wasn't just respect, it was peace. We thought we were late for dinner that night, but we were right on time to hear the truth. After that night, it was hard to look at things the same way. But to understand what happened at that dinner, you'd have to know who we were before it all began. My name is Margaret, and for nearly 40 years, my husband Edward and I built a quiet, steady life in a small town outside of Portland. We met young. He was back from service, still healing from what the war had taken from him. The scars on his face were deep and uneven. But when I looked at him, I never saw what others did. I saw the man who came home when others didn't. I saw the courage in the way he carried himself, the gentleness in the way he spoke. For decades, we lived a simple rhythm: early mornings with coffee, garden work in the afternoon, a slow dance in the kitchen every now and then. When our son Michael married Rachel, I hoped that same steadiness would pass down to them. She was beautiful and charming in the way people who have never known struggle often are. I wanted to love her, and at first, I thought I did. But there was always something beneath her smile, a stiffness when she looked at Edward, a polite laugh that never reached her eyes. Michael adored her, and for his sake, we tried not to see it. We told ourselves it was just nerves, or difference in upbringing, or the way young people are now, distracted, caught up in appearances. Still, I sometimes caught her watching Edward when she thought no one noticed, the way her gaze lingered, not in sympathy, but discomfort. Edward pretended not to see it. He was too kind to let pride win. But I knew. I always knew. Families are built on small choices, what we confront and what we ignore. Looking back, I realized that each time we looked the other way, we set the stage for what was coming. The dinner that would turn everything upside down was supposed to be just another family holiday. It was Christmas. The lights were strung, the table was set, and I thought the worst had already passed. I couldn't have been more wrong. The drive to Michael's house that evening was quiet. The roads shimmered with frost, and every house we passed glowed with Christmas lights that made the world look softer than it really was. Edward had one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on his knee, the faintest tremor in his fingers. He never said much before family gatherings. I knew it wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he cared too much. He'd been uneasy for weeks. Rachel's comments, her side glances, they had built something heavy between us. I tried to reassure him, telling him it was the holidays, that family moments were never perfect. But deep down, I feared what he didn't say aloud, that sometimes kindness feels like pretending not to notice cruelty. When we arrived, the house looked like a magazine cover. Candles, gold ornaments, perfectly folded napkins. Rachel's voice was the first thing I heard, light and sweet, greeting us at the door. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I caught the scent of wine on her breath, that faint sharpness that always made her bolder than usual. Dinner was beautiful on the surface. Laughter, toasts, small talk. But I could feel the tension ripple under the table. Edward tried to keep up, answering questions about old stories, service years, retirement plans. Rachel would nod, polite and distant. Her eyes flicked away every time his scars caught the candlelight. Later, while helping in the kitchen, I stepped into the hallway and froze. Rachel's voice floated from the next room. She was speaking to one of her friends, someone who didn't know us well. Her tone was low, but cruel. She said she could barely eat when Edward was at the table, that his face made her uncomfortable, that she didn't understand how I could live with it all those years. It was as if someone had poured ice water through my veins. I stood there, hidden by the corner, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it echoed in my chest. Every word twisted deeper. I thought about Edward sitting alone in the dining room, quietly sipping his drink, unaware that the woman who married his son was cutting him to pieces behind closed doors. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I wanted to scream, to defend him, to make her see what those scars meant. But something in me froze. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was grief. I only remember the sound of my own breathing, shallow and fast, as her words burned through the last bit of peace I had left. Then the front door opened. Cold air rushed in, followed by voices. Rachel's parents had arrived. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Her laughter stopped. I stepped back toward the hall, trying to compose myself before anyone saw me. Edward stood by the entryway, polite as always, extending his hand. And then it happened. Rachel's father looked at Edward, his smile fading. His face went pale. He said he remembered those scars. The room fell silent. In that single moment, I realized something none of us were ready for. The past wasn't finished with us yet. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The warmth of the room seemed to vanish, replaced by something sharp and electric. Rachel's father, Charles, stood there staring at Edward as if he had seen a ghost. His eyes filled with something between shock and memory, and I could feel the entire room tighten around that silence. Edward, as always, remained still. His posture didn't change, but I saw his fingers twitch at his side. I knew that look. It was the face he wore when the past came calling. Charles stepped closer. Slowly, like a man trying to believe his own eyes. His voice trembled when he said he remembered those scars, that he'd seen them before, years ago, on the face of a boy who had pulled him from a burning building when he was a teenager. A boy who vanished afterward without a word. It hit me all at once. Edward had never spoken about the fire. I knew he'd carried injuries from his time in service, but I'd always thought the worst of it came later. To realize that part of his story began long before, that he had saved someone and never taken credit, it was like seeing him anew. I felt pride rise in my chest, mixed with something heavier. But what struck me even more was Rachel's face. The color drained from it instantly. She wouldn't look at either of them. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass, pretending to sip. It wasn't surprise, it was recognition. The kind that doesn't come from hearing a new story, but from having one dragged into the light. Charles kept speaking, his voice full of awe, saying he'd spent years wondering who that young man was, how his life had been changed by a stranger's courage. And there, Edward stood, decades later, quiet, kind, and humble as always, his silence a lifetime's worth of modesty. I wanted to say something, to honor him somehow, but the moment wasn't mine to claim. I just watched as pride warred with grief inside me. All those years of him carrying pain alone, while others judged what they could not understand. And then I looked back at Rachel. Her expression had shifted, not to guilt, but to fear. That was when I knew. This wasn't a coincidence. She hadn't just been cruel out of ignorance. She had known exactly who Edward was, and she had chosen silence. No one touched their food after that. The room felt too full of things that couldn't be said. Rachel's father sat in stunned silence, her mother's eyes glistening with quiet shame. Edward, steady as ever, excused himself to the porch under the pretense of needing fresh air. I watched him go, his shoulders straight, his dignity intact, but I knew inside him something had cracked. Rachel tried to carry on, pretending the moment hadn't happened. Her voice was tight, her hands shaking slightly as she gathered plates that didn't need gathering. Michael looked from her to me, searching for some explanation, but I had none to give. The truth hung between us, cold and unmovable. Later that night, after most guests had left, Rachel's mother found me in the kitchen. She didn't have to say much, just enough for the pieces to fall into place. Rachel had known. For years. She'd known that Edward was the man who had saved her father's life. She'd overheard the story long before she ever married Michael. And instead of feeling gratitude, she'd buried it, hidden it, because she was ashamed of how it made her family look, indebted to someone she saw as beneath her. That knowledge hollowed me out. I wanted to hate her, but all I felt was sorrow. For Edward, who had spent his life believing silence was the nobler path. For Michael, who had built a life on a lie of love. And maybe even for Rachel herself, so fragile in her vanity that truth had become her enemy. When I went to find Edward, he was sitting quietly, snow gathering on his coat. He didn't look angry, just tired. I sat beside him without a word. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be understood. That night, I realized something simple yet devastating: lies don't destroy families. Fear does, and Rachel's fear wasn't just of the past. It was of the truth itself. A truth I was beginning to see ran much deeper than any of us imagined. The days after Christmas felt like walking through a fog. Everyone was quiet, cautious, as if speaking too loudly might break something fragile. But the silence didn't last long. Charles called a few days later, his voice heavy but determined. He'd looked into everything: old records, reports, even people who remembered the fire. What he found changed everything. Rachel hadn't just known about Edward's past. She'd gone out of her way to hide it. Months before their wedding, she'd hired a private investigator to confirm his identity. When she learned the truth, that the man her father owed his life to was the same man her husband called Dad, she panicked. Instead of telling Michael or her family, she started building a wall of lies. Payments had been made to keep stories buried. Subtle suggestions were whispered to make Michael drift further from us. It wasn't random tension, it was engineered distance. She'd painted Edward as a bitter man obsessed with his scars, too difficult to be around. I saw it now. Every strained dinner, every polite smile, every missed call. When the truth began to surface, Rachel didn't back down. She tried to rewrite the story. She posted online, spinning a tale that Edward had harassed her family, that he was dangerous. Watching her twist reality that way, out of fear, out of vanity, was like seeing someone drown while still insisting they could swim. But the lie didn't hold. Charles refused to let her bury the truth again. He came forward publicly, telling the real story. He spoke about the night of the fire, about the boy who had risked his life to save him, about decades of gratitude silenced by his daughter's pride. For Edward, it wasn't triumph, it was relief. His dignity was restored, not through anger or revenge, but through truth finding its voice. For Rachel, it was the beginning of her undoing. Her image, so carefully polished, shattered under the weight of her deceit. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, I felt something closer to mercy. Because when pride becomes fear, it eats a person from the inside out. But even with the truth finally out, I sensed it wasn't over. The storm hadn't passed. It was just gathering strength for what came next. When the story broke, it spread faster than I could process. Names, headlines, faces, all tangled with half-truths and public opinion. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was judgment served through whispers and screens. For weeks, every conversation in town circled back to it. Rachel's deceit, Edward's scars, the fire, the lies. Everyone had a version. Few cared which was true. Edward never defended himself. He didn't need to. His silence, the same silence that once made him seem distant, became his armor. He carried himself with the kind of calm only a man who has already survived worse could manage. I remember sitting beside him outside the courthouse one morning. He looked out at the gray sky and said that truth doesn't fight, it endures. Rachel tried to fight. She blamed stress, confusion, manipulation. She said she'd only acted to protect her family's reputation. But the evidence spoke louder. Records, payments, messages that painted a different story. Her lawyers twisted themselves in circles trying to soften what couldn't be softened. In the end, even she seemed to lose the thread of her own lies. Her friends vanished. Her business partners withdrew. The same people who had praised her charm now treated her like a stain on their image. The fall was quick, but not cruel. It was inevitable. She wasn't ruined by the truth. She was ruined by how long she'd tried to hide from it. In court, I watched her apologize. Not to us, not even to Edward, but to the idea of what she'd destroyed. Her voice was small, her face drawn, and in that moment, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a strange, aching mercy, because justice, when it finally comes, doesn't roar. It whispers. It restores balance, but never joy. Edward refused to press for damages. He said no amount of money could buy back peace. What he wanted was simple acknowledgement and an end. When the judge closed the final hearing, I felt a weight lift. Not the pain, but the silence that pain had left behind. Outside the courthouse, Edward turned to me and smiled, the first real smile I'd seen in years. The winter air was cold against my skin, but I remember thinking how light it felt. He didn't look like a man who'd won anything. He looked like someone finally free of the burden of proving himself. Justice had come, not with celebration, but with clarity. And as we walked away, I knew this was the beginning of something quieter, something that would hurt less with time, because even when truth wins, the past stays. What changes is how we carry it forward. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. Months passed after the hearings, and life slowly returned to something resembling peace. Edward spent more time in the garden again, his hands steady, his quiet presence filling our home with calm. He never spoke of Rachel or the trial, and I think that was his way of forgiving, by choosing not to live inside the wound anymore. Rachel moved away. I heard she found work in another town, something modest, far from the spotlight she once chased. I don't know if she ever truly changed, but I hope she learned what pride can cost a person when it grows louder than love. Michael visits more now. There's a gentleness in him I hadn't seen before. A recognition, maybe, of what his father carried in silence all those years. We don't talk about the past much. We don't need to. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I think about how truth doesn't destroy people. It reveals them. And in that revelation, there's pain. Yes, but also light. Edward taught me that dignity isn't something the world gives or takes. It's what you hold on to when no one's watching. The storm is long gone now, but its lessons remain. Have you ever faced a truth that changed everything you thought you knew? Tell me your story. I read everyone,